The morning Frances Fletcher found the foreclosure notice nailed to the gatepost of her family's land. She stood in the red Oklahoma dust for a long time without moving, the paper trembling in her fingers while the wind tried to take it from her. It was the spring of 1882, and the territory was just beginning to green up along the creek beds, and the cottonwood trees were pale with new leaves. And ordinarily Frances would have noticed all of that beauty, because she was a woman who paid attention to beautiful things. But the notice was dated with a deadline of 30 days, and the sum printed in the banker's careful hand was $412, and she knew, without even going back inside to count what was left in the tin behind the kitchen stove, that they did not have it. They did not come close to having it. She folded the paper, tucked it into the pocket of her work apron, and went inside to make breakfast for her father, who had not been well since the winter fever that had settled into his chest and refused to leave entirely, and for her younger brother Thomas, who was 16 and strong but who could not do the work of two grown men no matter how hard he tried. She cracked eggs into the skillet and listened to the grease pop and watched the yolks run yellow across the iron, and she thought about everything she had already sold. She had sold her mother's silver brush set. She had sold 2 of the 3 plow horses. She had sold 40 head of cattle when the price per head was so low it made her want to weep, and she had sold the good wagon and kept only the old one with the cracked axle that Thomas kept mending with wire and prayer. She had not been able to sell the farm. She had not been willing to even consider it, because this land had been her father's dream and her mother's grave, and the only solid thing she knew. And now a man named Harlan Prout, who ran the Clearwater Bank out of the town of Dunn's Crossing, was going to take it from them in 30 days if she could not produce $412 that she absolutely did not have. Her father came to the table walking slowly, leaning on the back of each chair as he passed it, and he sat down with the careful deliberateness of a man who had to think about sitting down. He was 53 years old and looked older than that now, with the gray coming heavy into his beard and his eyes gone a little watery from the sickness. He had been a big man once, her father. Samuel Fletcher had broken this ground with his own hands and built the house board by board and dug the well himself and planted the first crops, and seeing him diminished like this was one of the ongoing quiet griefs of Frances's daily life. "You look pale," he said to her when she set his plate down. "I am always pale," she said, which was true enough. She had the kind of fair skin that freckled across the nose in summer and went almost translucent in winter, and her hair was the dark auburn that had come down from her mother's Irish people, and her eyes were gray. She was 24 years old and had been running this farm more or less alone for the better part of 2 years. Something happened, he said, because he knew her well. She considered lying to him, but she had never been good at it, and so she took the notice from her apron pocket and smoothed it on the table beside his plate. She watched him read it. She watched the color drain from his already pale face. "Frances," he said. "I know," she said. "I didn't know it had gotten this bad," he said, and there was a grief in his voice that was particular to fathers who feel they have failed their children, a very specific and very heavy grief. "It crept up on us," she said, sitting down across from him and folding her hands on the table. "The drought year before last took more than I let on. I thought we could make it back this season, but the new calves died, and then you got sick, and the medicine was costly." Thomas came in from the barn smelling of horses and mourning, stamping the mud from his boots, and he read the room immediately the way young people sometimes can when they've been watching adults manage hard things long enough to recognize the signs. He looked at the paper on the table and his jaw went tight. "What are we going to do?" he asked. Frances looked at her father, and her father looked at her, and neither of them had a ready answer, and that silence said more than words would have. Later that morning, after she had washed the dishes and hung the wet cloth to dry and put bread on to rise, Frances walked the perimeter of the farm the way she sometimes did when she needed to think. She walked along the fence line on the north side, where the posts were good solid cedar because her father had replaced them 2 summers ago before he got sick, and she walked the creek side, where the willows dragged their long branches in the water. She walked past the kitchen garden that was just coming up with the early radishes and onion sets she had put in, and she walked past the barn, and she stood for a while looking at the south pasture. The south pasture was where their neighbor kept his bull. She had been carefully not thinking about Gideon Conroy for approximately 18 months, which was how long she had been carefully not thinking about him, which was to say, she thought about him quite often but with a determined effort to dismiss each thought as it arose. He was her nearest neighbor, with his land running along the eastern edge of the Fletcher property for about 1.5 miles. He ran cattle, good quality cattle, and he was known in Dunn's Crossing as a man who worked hard and said little and kept his affairs orderly. She knew him mostly from the occasional encounter in town, where he would tip his hat to her outside the general store and ask after her father's health in a voice that was low and even and genuinely concerned, and from the one time his fence had gone down in a storm and 3 of his cattle had come onto her land, and he had come to retrieve them the next morning, hat in hand, apologetic, offering to repair any damage they might have caused. He was 30 years old, brown from the sun, with dark hair that curled a little at his collar and jaw that always looked like it needed shaving. He was not, she had always thought, an easy man to read. He was courteous and decent and direct when he spoke, but there was a reserve about him, a quality of keeping himself a little apart from things that she had never been able to fully account for. His prize bull was the thing everyone in the county talked about. The animal was named Duke, which struck Frances as slightly absurd for a bull, but she supposed the name fit. He was an enormous red and white Hereford of exceptional bloodlines, the product of Gideon's careful breeding program, and he had won the regional cattle show in Caldwell twice running. Ranchers came from considerable distances to use Duke for stud, and the fees Gideon charged were significant and well-earned. That bull was the foundation of everything Gideon was building out on his land. Frances stood at the fence looking at the south pasture, and she was not thinking about Gideon Conroy's prize bull. She was thinking about $412 in 30 days and her father's gray face at the breakfast table. And then she was thinking about the bull again, and she felt ashamed of the thought that followed it, and she went back inside to check her bread. The next morning, she drove the old wagon into Dunn's Crossing to speak with Harlan Pruitt at the bank. The town of Dunn's Crossing sat on a bend of the Cimarron River and had come up fast the way Oklahoma Territory towns did in those days, with false-fronted buildings along the main street and a hotel that was too ambitious for the size of the population, and a saloon that was too well-attended. The bank was a proper brick building, the only one on the street, and Harlan Pruitt was very proud of it. He was a compact, self-important man in his mid-40s, with a gold watch chain across his middle, and an expression that suggested he found the world consistently disappointing. He received Frances in his office and offered her a chair with the slightly patronizing courtesy that certain men of that era and type extended to women who came to them with financial problems, as though they were children who had gotten lost and needed patient guidance back to the proper path. "Miss Fletcher," he said, settling back in his chair, "I trust you received our notice." "I did," she said. She kept her back straight and her hands in her lap and her voice even. She had worn her best dress, the dark blue wool, because she understood that she was trying to negotiate and that one should wear one's best when negotiating. "I was hoping we might discuss the terms. An extension, perhaps, given my father's illness." Pruitt shook his head with what appeared to be genuine regret, but was probably just the performance of genuine regret. "The bank cannot continue to extend indefinitely, Miss Fletcher. We have been more than patient. The original loan was taken out 6 years ago, and there have been 2 previous extensions, as I'm sure you recall." "I recall," she said. "The board has been quite clear that we cannot go beyond the current deadline," he said. "I am sorry for your family's difficulties. I truly am, but business is business. Business is business. She had known he would say something like that. She had known this meeting would end the way it was ending. She had come because she could not face her father and her brother without having tried every ordinary avenue first. She drove home through the clear spring afternoon with the wagon bed empty and her heart considerably heavier than when she had set out. The horses, the two that remained, walked at their usual pace, and the road wound through the greening country, and she tried to think what to do. It was on the road home that she encountered Gideon Conroy. He was riding toward town on that good-looking gray horse of his, and he pulled up when he saw her coming, because the road was narrow in that stretch, and it was only civil. He touched his hat brim. "Miss Fletcher," he said. "Mr. Conroy," she said. They had the brief, polite exchange that their acquaintance warranted. He asked after her father. She said her father was improving, which was an optimistic interpretation of the truth. He said he was glad to hear it. There was a moment of silence in which the horses shifted and a meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass beside the road. He looked at her more directly than usual. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not crying now, but there was something in her face in the aftermath of that meeting with Prout that she could not entirely conceal, and Gideon Conroy was a more observant man than he generally let on. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the way he asked it was without the patronizing quality that Prout had used, without the quality of asking a question one doesn't truly want answered. He asked it as though he genuinely wanted to know. She considered her answer for a moment. "I will be," she said. It was not exactly a lie. She intended to be all right. She simply had not worked out how yet. He held her gaze for a beat longer, and then he nodded, and they parted ways, and she drove home and sat at the kitchen table for a long time after supper that night, alone with the lamp and the problem and the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. What happened next was not something she planned. It evolved, the way certain things do, out of a series of smaller decisions, each of which seemed entirely reasonable in isolation. 3 days after her trip to town, she walked across to the Conroy property. She had a reason ready. She wanted to ask whether he was missing a length of fence wire that had blown onto her land in a recent wind, and it was a real reason, not entirely invented. But she admitted to herself as she crossed the pasture between their properties, looking for something she could not quite name. She found him at his work bench in the barn, mending a piece of harness with the focused precision he seemed to bring to every task. He looked up when her shadow crossed the doorway and stood immediately, the way he always did when a woman came near, with a sort of automatic courtesy that felt like it had been trained into him very young. "Miss Fletcher," he said, setting the harness down. She told him about the fence wire. He confirmed it was likely his and thanked her for mentioning it. He offered her water, which she accepted, and they stood in the shade of the barn doorway while she drank from the dipper, and the sound of Duke came to them from the pasture, the deep low of that enormous bull, and she looked toward the sound involuntarily. "He is something to see," she said, because he was. "He is," Gideon agreed, and there was a quiet pride in his voice that he didn't otherwise show very readily. They talked about cattle for a while, which was the kind of conversation that two people who run adjacent properties find natural, and then somehow they were talking about the drought year and the price of feed and the difficulty of the previous winter, and Frances found herself saying more than she had intended to. Not everything, not the specific sum or the deadline, but enough that Gideon, who was a careful listener, would have been able to put the broad shape of it together. When she left, she walked home feeling odd, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. There was something about talking to Gideon Conroy, she was discovering, that had the effect of making her feel less alone, which was both a relief and a somewhat dangerous thing to notice. 2 days later he came by. She was in the kitchen garden on her knees in the dirt, her hands dark with soil, and she heard his horse and stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, and there was Gideon Conroy dismounting at her gate, carrying his hat in his hands the way men do when they have come on serious business. Her father was on the porch in the rocking chair that Thomas had set out for him on warm mornings, and Gideon went to him first, which was right and proper, and they exchanged a few words that Frances couldn't hear from the garden. Then Gideon came toward her and she came to meet him at the garden gate. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said. "You are not," she said. She looked at him steadily, wondering what this was. His visits to her property were uncommon. She could count the significant ones on one hand. He turned his hat in his hands once slowly, which she noticed was a thing he did when he was working up to saying something that cost him something to say. "I don't want to intrude," he said, "and what I'm about to say might offend you, and if it does, I ask you to set it down to good intentions rather than presumption." "Tell me plainly," she said. Plain speaking was the thing she liked best about the people she liked, and she was already beginning to understand that she liked Gideon Conroy more than she had previously allowed herself to admit. He looked at her directly. "I went to town yesterday," he said. "I had business at the bank. I ran into Ed Mercer, who works the teller window." He paused. "I am not saying Ed Mercer told me anything he shouldn't have told me. But there are things a man in a small town can gather from a conversation without anyone saying the specific words." Frances felt a flush creep up her neck. She was a private woman, and the idea that her affairs were broadly known, even in vague outline, was uncomfortable. "Whatever you gathered," she said carefully, "I am managing the situation." "I believe you are trying to," he said, with no condescension in it at all, just a kind of simple acknowledgement of fact. "And I believe you would manage it without any help if you had the means. But the means is the problem." She said nothing. She was watching him. "I have a proposition," he said, "and it is a business proposition. I want to be clear about that because I don't want you to think I am trying to put you in my debt in any personal way or to use your difficulty against you. I am not that kind of man." "I know you are not," she said, and she was surprised to find she meant it fully. He looked at the pasture for a moment, at the distance where his property began. "Duke wins the Caldwell show again this fall. I believe he will. His offspring are getting strong prices. I have been building a breeding program around him for 3 years. He paused. "He is the most valuable thing I own." She went very still. "Harlan Prout has a ranch on the side," Gideon continued in that level voice. "He has been wanting Duke for his breeding program for 2 years. I have turned him down twice because I didn't want to sell, but I spoke to him this morning." "Gideon," she said, and then stopped, because she had used his given name without planning to, and they had never been on given name terms before, and she felt the awkwardness of it briefly and then let it pass because it seemed to fit the gravity of the moment. "You cannot sell Duke. That program you have been building, I can start again," he said simply. "It will take longer, but I can start again. You cannot start again with a different family farm." She stared at him. The garden was very quiet around them. The early bees were working the rows of flowering herbs near the fence. Her father was motionless on the porch, watching them with the particular stillness of a man who has understood the nature of a conversation without hearing the words. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, and her voice came out lower than she had intended. "Prout wants the bull," Gideon said. "He has offered me $450 for Duke. I have agreed to the sale on the condition that the proceeds are applied directly against the Fletcher farm debt." Prout agreed. "He gets what he wants, you get what you need, and the bank doesn't end up in the business of selling farmland, which is a complicated and politically unpopular thing to do in the territory these days, which I also pointed out to him." She felt her throat tighten in a way she had not expected. She had prepared herself in the 3 days since the bank visit to face any number of difficult outcomes. She had not prepared herself for this. "You would do this," she said. Not a question. "A kind of reckoning." "I would," he said. "I have." "Why?" she asked, and the word came out with more rawness than she intended. He was quiet for a moment. The hat turned in his hands one more time. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. "Because you have worked this land alongside your father for years and you shouldn't lose it to a bad sequence of circumstances. Because—" He paused, and for the first time in the conversation something shifted in his expression. Something careful and contained shifted and showed itself for just a moment. "Because I would like for you to stay my neighbor, Miss Fletcher. And I recognize that may be a selfish motive dressed up as a charitable one, but I am giving you the honest version of it." She looked at him for a long time. She was a woman who made careful decisions, and this was a situation in which careful decision-making was required. But she was also a woman who was capable of reading honesty when she saw it, and she was reading it now. "I cannot simply accept this," she said. "That is too large a gift. That is not a loan I could repay in any foreseeable." "It is not a gift," he said. "It is not a loan either. I have not decided what it is exactly. But I trust that between two honest people, something fair can be worked out. And I would ask you not to let your pride stand between your family and their home." That last part landed somewhere deep and true, because she had a great deal of pride and she knew it, and she also knew he was right. "I need to speak with my father," she said. "Of course," he said. He replaced his hat on his head and touched the brim to her in that familiar gesture. "I have told Prout the agreement stands regardless of your answer to me. The debt will be cleared. What you choose to do about that, I leave entirely to you." He walked back to his horse and mounted in the easy way of a man who has been on horseback since childhood, and rode back toward his property at a walk, not looking back, which she noticed, and which she somehow appreciated. She stood in the garden a while longer in the warm morning with her dirty hands and her full heart, and then she went to the porch and sat on the step below her father's chair and told him what had just happened. Samuel Fletcher listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is a remarkable man." "Yes," she said, "he is." "What are you going to do about him?" "Papa," she said. "I am sick, Francis, not blind," he said, with a touch of his old dry humor. "And I am your father, which means I have been watching you not look at that man for quite some time now, and wondering when one or both of you was going to do something about it." She turned to look at him and found him watching her with his watery but still shrewd eyes, and she felt the complicated rush of being completely known by the person who had known you longest. "There is nothing to do," she said. "A man does a generous thing and I should fall on his neck. That's not how I am." "No," he said, "it is not, but you could thank him properly. You could invite him to supper. You could stop treating your own feelings like they are a problem to be solved and just let them be what they are." "You have strong opinions about this," she said. "I'm your father and I am ill, and I would like to see you settled and happy before I am too much worse," he said, which was so direct and so quiet that it took the breath from her for a moment. She reached up and took his hand, and they sat like that in the morning sun, and she did not argue with him any further. The deed was done within the week. Prout was, if not a good man, at least a man who honored his agreements when they benefited him, and the agreement with Gideon benefited him considerably. Duke was led across to Prout's property on a Wednesday morning, and Frances watched from the edge of her south pasture as that great red and white animal walked away, and she felt the loss of him on Gideon's behalf as a physical thing. She had the written confirmation of the debt's cancellation from the bank by Thursday. She held the paper in the kitchen with Thomas looking over her shoulder and her father's voice coming from the next room asking what it said, and she read it twice and then a third time, and then she sat down because her knees felt peculiar. "We kept it," Thomas said, in a young voice thickened by unexpected emotion. "Francis, we kept the farm." "We did," she said. "Because of Conroy," Thomas said. "Because of Gideon Conroy," she agreed. That evening she baked. She was a good cook, her mother had made sure of that, and she worked in the kitchen with the deliberateness of a person giving a task their full attention because the task matters. She made a proper apple pie from the dried apples in the cellar, and a pan of corn bread, and a pot of beans with ham, and she packed it all into the basket she used for church socials, and walked across to Gideon's property in the early evening while the sky was going pink and gold at the horizon. She had never been inside Gideon's house. She had seen it from the road, a solid, well-made frame house, larger than necessary for a single man, which had made her speculate in the past about his intentions, and she had been in the yard briefly when his cattle came over. But she had never come to his door. She knocked and heard his footstep inside, measured and unhurried, and the door opened and there he was, coatless in his work shirt, a look of genuine surprise on his face that was quickly replaced by something warmer. "Miss Fletcher," he said. "I brought supper," she said, holding up the basket with a steadiness she was proud of given that her heart was making a considerable amount of noise inside her chest. "Because a man who does what you did deserves at least a decent meal, and also because I have been raised to express gratitude in concrete terms." He looked at the basket and then at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did when he was holding back a smile, which she had catalogued without meaning to over the course of their acquaintance. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He stepped back and held the door for her, and she came inside. His house was clean in the way of a man who lives alone and keeps things orderly by discipline rather than inclination. There was a lack of softness to it, no curtains on the windows, a serviceable table and 2 chairs, a wood stove, a shelf of books that surprised her slightly. She noted the books immediately. "You read," she said, setting the basket on the table. "When I have the time," he said, as though it required some defense. "What do you read?" she asked, because she was genuinely curious. "History mostly," he said. "Some geography. I have a habit of wanting to know the shape of the world beyond what I can see." She looked at the shelf. There was a worn history of the Mexican territories, a book about the topography of the western United States, something she did not recognize, and she looked more carefully, a well-thumbed copy of a collection of poems. "And poetry," she said with a tone of discovery. He looked briefly as though he wished she had not noticed that. "My mother's," he said. "She left it to me." "Is she gone?" Francis asked, because the tense of it suggested so. 6 years ago," he said. "My father before that." "I'm sorry," she said. "My mother has been gone 5 years." There was the small recognition that happens between two people who have each carried a particular kind of loss, a settling of something in the space between them. They set the table together, which was domestic and simple and should have been awkward but was not, and they ate by the lamp with the windows going dark around them, and they talked. They talked about their mothers briefly and gently. They talked about the land, their own land and the land in general, the way the territory was opening up, the changes coming. He had opinions about the way the cattle range was being broken up by homesteaders, not bitter ones, just thoughtful. She had opinions about the changes coming for women, the limited rights they had in matters of property and law, and she stated them directly, waiting for the slight withdrawal she sometimes got from men when she talked this way. He did not withdraw. He leaned forward slightly and said, "I've thought about that. My mother couldn't hold property in her own name after my father died, which made the year between his death and mine coming of age very complicated. It shouldn't be that way." She looked at him with a regard that went quite a bit deeper than polite attention. After supper, he walked her home. The night was clear and enormous, the Oklahoma sky scattered over with stars in the way it gets when there is no cloud at all, and the air was cool and sweet with the grass smell of spring. They walked the fence line between their properties, not touching, with perhaps 2 feet of space between them, and they talked about less serious things, and she discovered that Gideon Conroy had a dry, understated humor that she hadn't previously had enough conversation with him to find. At her gate he stopped, and so did she. The house was lit behind her, her father's lamp, Thomas's shadow moving behind the curtain of the kitchen window. "Thank you for supper," he said. "Thank you for the farm," she said, and her voice went quiet at the end of it. He was looking at her in the dark and the starlight, and she was aware of the precise distance between them and the specific quality of the silence. "I wonder," he said slowly, "if I might call on you, properly, with your father's permission." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I believe my father would welcome that considerably." As would I. Even in the starlight she could see the change in his expression, the way something resolved itself, like a knot coming undone. "Then I will call," he said. "Thursday, if that suits you." "Thursday suits me," she said. He touched his hat and turned back toward his property, and she stood at the gate watching him go. and she thought that she had not felt this kind of warmth, this particular human warmth, since before her mother had died and the farm had become her primary occupation, and love had seemed like something that happened to other people in less demanding circumstances. She went inside and her father was still awake, sitting with his lamp and his Bible, and he looked at her face and smiled, which was the most she had seen him smile in months. Thursday came with the particular weight of anticipated things. Frances was up early and stayed busy all day, because busy was the only way she knew to manage anticipation, and by the time the afternoon began to angle toward evening and she heard the horse at the gate, she had baked 2 batches of biscuits, reorganized the pantry, and swept the porch twice. Gideon came with a small bunch of wildflowers that he had clearly gathered from the field rather than purchased, which she found infinitely more appealing than something bought. He sat with her father on the porch for a solid hour, and she could hear them talking through the kitchen window while she worked, and what she heard was 2 men who respected each other, talking about cattle and weather and the state of the territory, and occasionally her father's laugh, rusty but genuine. When he came into the kitchen to find her, he brought the scent of the outdoors with him, and he looked at the kitchen, at the strings of dried herbs and the clean dishes and the window above the sink with its view of the garden, and he said, "You have made this place into something." "My mother and I together," she said. "I just kept it going." "That is not a small thing," he said, "keeping something going." They sat at the table, and she poured coffee, and they talked the way people do when they are just beginning to understand each other, with the particular attention of early acquaintance when everything is still fresh and interesting, and the other person is still a landscape being mapped. He told her about growing up in Texas, outside of San Antonio, in a large family of cattle people, and coming to the territory at 25 when the land was opening up, staking his claim, building his operation year by year. He told her about the early failures, which he described without self-pity and without excessive drama, just as facts. A disease that had taken his first herd, a well that had collapsed, the first winter, which had been brutal. She told him about her own family's first years in the territory, which her father had told her about often enough that she felt she remembered them even though she had been too young. She told him about her mother, carefully, about who Eleanor Fletcher had been, a woman from County Clare who had come to America as a child, and had approached this western frontier with an unshakable cheerful pragmatism that Frances had been trying to emulate ever since. He listened with the quality of listening that meant he was actually listening and not just waiting to speak, and when she finished he said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was the best person I have known," Frances said, "except possibly my father and possibly you, though I haven't known you long enough yet to be certain." She heard herself say it and felt a slight heat in her face, because it was a very direct thing to say and she hadn't quite planned it. He was looking at her with an expression she was starting to learn, a kind of focused quiet that preceded something important. "You will be able to judge eventually," he said, "given that I intend to give you considerable time to make the assessment." Her heart did the thing it had taken to doing in his presence, that uncertain brightening. He called the following Thursday and the Thursday after that. By the 4th visit, Thomas had stopped pretending not to watch them from the barn door and was openly and unashamedly curious, and her father had taken to making himself comfortable on the porch in the early afternoon, and then announcing with transparent convenience that he needed to rest inside when Gideon arrived, leaving Frances and Gideon alone in the porch chairs in a propriety that stretched thin at the edges. They walked the farm boundary one evening in late May, which had become warm enough that the wildflowers were thick in the grass and the creek was running full. He asked her questions about her land, what she was planting, what she hoped to do with the south pasture once she had the means, and she discovered that her own feelings about the land were clearer when she was articulating them to him, as though the speaking of them made them more real. "I want a proper dairy operation eventually," she said, as they stood by the creek. 3 or 4 good milk cows, butter, cheese. There's a market for it in town and the hotel takes what it can get. And I want the kitchen garden doubled. And I would like to eventually. She stopped herself. What? He asked. She looked down at the water moving over the stones. Plant roses along the front fence. My mother always wanted to and we never did, and I have been meaning to for 2 years, and there has always been something more practical to do. He was quiet for a moment. Roses aren't impractical, he said. A place should have something beautiful in it just because it's beautiful. She turned to look at him, this man in the late afternoon light, and felt with a clarity that surprised her how much she had come to count on his presence. He was looking at the creek, and then he turned and found her watching him, and neither of them looked away. "Frances," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded in his low voice like something considered. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out quieter than intended. "I am not a man who speaks quickly about things that matter," he said. "I think you know that about me by now, but I would rather say what I mean and have the truth of it be clear than be clever about it." He paused, looking at her steadily. "I have found over these last weeks that I think about you continuously, and that the best parts of my days are the parts that have you in them. And I would like to know whether that is something I should try to set aside or whether it is something you would consider receiving." The creek moved over its stones. A bird called twice in the willows and went silent. "I would not want you to set it aside," she said, "because I am unable to set aside the corresponding thing, and it would be very unfair of me to ask that of you." He reached out and took her hand where it hung at her side, his rough, warm fingers wrapping around hers, and they stood at the creek in the warm May evening, and everything that had been building between them found its proper name. She was not a woman who could be easily described as breathless, but she felt something in that moment that she had no other word for. She turned her hand in his so that they were properly holding rather than him simply holding her, palm to palm, fingers intertwined, and she felt him exhale as though he had been holding his breath. "I want to court you properly," he said, "with the intention of asking you a serious question when the time is right." She looked up at him. He was close, closer than he had ever stood before, and she could see the sun lines at the corners of his dark eyes and the particular steadiness in his gaze that she had been cataloging and valuing for months now without admitting it. "Court me properly then," she said, "and ask your question when you're ready." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, brief and warm and serious, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle somewhere in her chest where it intended to stay. They walked back to the farm as the last light went red at the horizon, still holding hands, the grass bending around them in the evening wind. Her father, when he saw their faces, said nothing. He simply picked up his Bible and opened it to somewhere in the middle and smiled at the page. June came in gold and green. The planting was progressing well, and Frances was cautiously optimistic about the season's crop. Thomas had found work 2 days a week at a nearby ranch, which brought in a small but steady amount of cash, and their father was continuing to improve in the slow but genuine way of a man whose illness has crested and is ebbing. The farm was still lean and the work was still relentless, but the foreclosure notice was gone and the debt was cleared and the land was theirs, and on the days when it was all very hard, Frances held that fact close and let it be enough. Gideon called on Tuesdays now as well as Thursdays. On Sundays they attended the same church in Dunn's Crossing, which the congregation noted with the discreet but thorough attention that small communities pay to the romantic developments of their members. Mrs. Ada Holloway, who ran the millinery shop and had opinions about everything, told Frances that she thought it was a very suitable match, which was so entirely beside the point of what Frances felt about it that she had to work to compose a polite response. What Frances felt about it was not suitable. It was not suitable in the sense of matching practical circumstances, though it did that. It was large and growing and occasionally frightening in the particular way that very true things can be frightening when you have spent a long time not having them. She had not thought much about love for a very long time. She had loved her mother and lost her and turned away from that grief into work. She had loved her father and watched him diminish and turn that grief into management. She loved Thomas with the protective ferocity of an eldest sibling who has stood between a young person and hardship. But the love that was growing in her for Gideon Conroy was a different animal entirely. It was for her alone, not in her role as daughter or sister or caretaker, just for Frances herself, and she found she did not entirely know what to do with something that was only hers. She told him this one afternoon. She was not sure she meant to, but they had reached a level of honesty with each other that sometimes surprised her with what it drew out. They were sitting on the porch after supper, her father inside, Thomas in the barn, the evening spreading peacefully around them. The roses she had ordered from the catalog in town had arrived the previous week. Gideon had surprised her with that, had placed the order himself and paid for it, which was a thing she had been flustered and deeply moved by in equal measure. And 3 young plants were in the ground along the front fence, still small but established. She told him about the love that was only hers and not part of any role she played and how unfamiliar it felt. He was quiet for a while, listening. Then he said, "I understand that. I have been very practical for a very long time." Practical was safe. You can manage practical. "Yes," she said. "This is not particularly manageable," he said with the understated directness that was entirely him. "No," she agreed. He turned to look at her in the evening light. "I'm not afraid of it," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I was at first when I understood what was happening, but I am not afraid of it anymore." "What changed?" she asked. "I decided that being afraid of something real and good was a waste of the real and good thing," he said. She looked at him and felt something in herself ease and settle, the last guarded corner of her, the one that had been waiting for a reason not to trust this, finding that reason simply did not exist. He proposed in July. It was not dramatic in the ways that proposals in stories sometimes are. He did not do it at a grand moment or a scenic location, though the occasion was beautiful in its own way. He did it on a Wednesday evening when he had come by with a purpose that was not one of his regular calling days, which had made Thomas raise his eyebrows significantly when he saw Gideon at the gate, and which had made Frances's heart do its particular thing before she had even heard what he had to say. He spoke to her father first, which she appreciated, and she could hear the low register of their voices through the wall, and could not hear the words but could hear the emotional shape of the conversation, her father's slow and considered response, the handshake that she imagined rather than heard. Then Gideon came to find her in the garden, where she was doing the evening watering because she had been unable to sit still. He came and stood at the garden gate in the warm twilight, and she straightened and looked at him and he looked at her, and the moment between them was so full of everything that had accumulated over the past months that it had a kind of weight. "I have spoken with your father," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard you. He gave me his blessing," he said. "I am glad," she said. "Frances." He came through the garden gate and crossed to where she was standing between the bean rows, and he was close enough that she could see the slight tension in his jaw that meant this mattered deeply to him. He took her hands, both of them, and looked at her straight. "I would like to ask you to marry me. I would like to ask you to let me be your partner in this life, for all of it, the hard parts and the good parts, and I will be the most honest and the most faithful person I know how to be, which I believe you already know is true." She felt tears rise, which surprised her because she was not a crier, and she let them stand in her eyes without falling. "I love you," she said, because it seemed the most important thing to establish before she answered anything else. "I have been working very hard not to say that for several months." Something opened in his face like a window. "I love you," he said, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of grace. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He cupped her face in his rough hands and kissed her for the first time, warm and unhurried and completely earnest, in the middle of the garden in the twilight with the bean plants growing around them, and the rose starts putting out their first tiny leaves along the fence beyond. And she stood up on her toes slightly, and kissed him back with everything in her that had been waiting to find its right place. And it felt like arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward without knowing the destination. When they came inside, Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table with an expression of studied nonchalance that convinced no one, and her father was in his chair with the satisfied look of a man whose affairs are coming right. "Well," Thomas said. "We are going to get married," Francis said. Thomas made a sound that was half laugh and half something younger, and then came across the kitchen and embraced his sister with the emphatic force of a 16-year-old who does not do things by half measures. Then he put his hand out to Gideon in a way that was clearly meant to be very adult and formal, and Gideon shook it with precisely the right seriousness. Her father reached out from his chair and took Gideon's hand. He held it for a moment and said, "Take care of her." "I will take care of her," Gideon said, "for the rest of my life." They set the date for October, when the harvest would be in and the worst of the summer heat past. Frances wrote to her mother's sister in Kansas, her Aunt Mary, who was the only extended family she had, and received in return a letter that contained more exclamation marks than Frances had ever seen in a single written document, and a promise to come for the wedding. In the months between the proposal and the October date, the daily texture of their relationship settled into something that Frances had not previously known to want, and now found she could not imagine doing without. He was there, consistently and reliably, not in a hovering way but in the way of a man who had decided something, and acted on the decision. He helped Thomas with the heavier work on the Fletcher farm, which Thomas accepted with the pride of a young man who is being treated as an equal partner rather than a boy in need of charity. He listened to her father in the evenings and they played chess, which was her father's particular pleasure, and Gideon was good enough at the game that Samuel Fletcher had to think seriously to win, which her father said was the most important thing about an opponent. And with Frances, in those long summer evenings, they talked. They talked about everything. About her plans for the farm and his plans for his operation, which he was rebuilding slowly and without complaint, beginning the long work of establishing a new breeding program with the 2 younger bulls he had. About the territory and what they thought its future looked like. About books she had read and books he had read, and one perfect summer night he read to her from his mother's poetry collection while she sat beside him on the porch, and his voice in the warm, dark reading Tennyson was something she stored away in the part of her memory reserved for things she intended to keep always. He was building things into his house. He had made curtains, which she had not expected of him and which made her laugh with surprised delight, simple cotton ones from fabric he had purchased in town, hung at the windows so the house would be ready for her. He was adding a room onto the back for when they decided they needed more space, a thing they had not yet specifically discussed, but which the addition implied clearly enough. She ordered seeds from the catalog for a larger kitchen garden at his house. She borrowed her father's copy of a book on soil improvement that she thought would help with the particular clay content of one of Gideon's fields. She was not moving into his life so much as weaving her life into his and his into hers, the threads crossing and recrossing, until it became impossible to say which was which. The summer passed in labor and sweetness in roughly equal measure. The Oklahoma heat was tremendous and the work was unrelenting, but there were evenings at the creek and Sunday afternoons when the chores were done and they sat together in the shade, and the world felt very abundant. She told him, on one of those afternoons, about the specific weight of grief that had come after her mother's death, the particular loneliness of the years since. She told him about the times she had been afraid, not of poverty specifically, but of not being able to hold everything together, of the moment when it would fall apart despite everything she had done to prevent it. She told him about the foreclosure notice and how she had stood at the gatepost in the April dust and not been able to move. He listened to all of it. He did not try to resolve it or diminish it or offer consolation that minimized the difficulty. He just listened, and when she was done he said, You held it all together for a very long time by yourself. I am going to spend a considerable amount of time making sure you don't have to do that anymore." She put her head on his shoulder, which was something she had not done before, and he adjusted so she was comfortable, and they sat in the shade and listened to the creek. And she thought about how the worst spring of her life had somehow also been the beginning of the best thing in it. The wedding was on a Saturday in the middle of October, when the Oklahoma autumn was doing what it sometimes did, going absolutely gold and perfect, with a sky so blue it seemed improbable, and a light that made everything look significant. The ceremony was held at the church in Dunn's Crossing, performed by Reverend Holt, who was a sensible and decent man. There were perhaps 40 people in attendance, the neighbors and town people who had known the Fletchers and the Conroys, and who had been quietly following the development of this particular story, with the warm interest that communities invest in love stories that seem correct and right. Frances wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, cream-colored wool with a high neck and small buttons to the wrist. Aunt Mary, who had arrived the previous Tuesday and immediately taken over the kitchen in the way of women who express love through feeding people, had helped her with the buttons that morning and had wept considerably, which Frances had expected. Thomas had polished his good boots until they shone, and he was very tall standing at the front of the church, having had another growth surge over the summer. Her father walked her down the aisle. He walked slowly and with his cane, which he had recently begun using on the bad days, but he walked the whole of it, straight-backed, with Frances's hand through his arm, and when they reached the front and she looked at Gideon standing there waiting for her, she saw that his eyes were bright with something she recognized, because she felt it herself. He took her hand from her father's arm and held it, and they stood before Reverend Holt, and the words were the old words, the ones that had been said over couples for centuries, and they were worth every repetition. When Reverend Holt said that Gideon could kiss his bride and Gideon kissed her, the congregation made a warm collective sound that was part laughter and part something more tender, and Thomas made a specific sound that was entirely brotherly and somewhat embarrassing, and her father's hand found hers and squeezed it briefly, and she thought her mother would have been very happy. They held the wedding celebration at the Conroy property because it was larger, with tables set up in the yard and Aunt Mary's remarkable cooking spread out across them. People ate and talked, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a guitar, and there was dancing in the yard in the golden October afternoon, while the light went amber and then red and finally purple. Gideon danced with her. He was not a natural dancer. He had told her as much with typical directness, but he was capable of learning things, and he had evidently given this some thought, because he led her through a waltz with enough competence that she laughed, and he admitted that he had been practicing with Thomas in the barn the previous week, which made her love him so thoroughly and completely that she had to stop dancing and just look at him. "You practiced dancing with my brother," she said. "I was not going to embarrass you at your own wedding," he said, with perfect dignity. She pulled him close and said, very quietly just for him, "I love you quite beyond my ability to sensibly express it." He looked at her. "Good," he said, with that quiet, complete certainty of his, and held her closer, and they danced. Her father sat in a chair at the edge of the dancing and watched with the expression of a man at peace, which was the thing she had wanted most to give him, and it turned out she had found it by not engineering it but by letting it come, which was perhaps a lesson about other things as well. The harvest that fall was the best the Fletcher land had put up in 3 years. Frances and Gideon worked the two properties in the coordinated way they had begun to develop over the summer, combining their labor and their equipment where it made sense, and respecting the separateness of each holding where that made more sense. He had a more powerful plow team. She had better kitchen crops and a sense for the soil on the creek side that came from years of intimate attention to it. Thomas worked alongside them both with an energy and a willingness that filled Frances with gratitude, and a love for her brother that was made more vivid now, that her heart had more room in it. He was growing into himself. Thomas, growing from the wiry, frightened boy he had been in April when that foreclosure notice appeared into something more settled and confident. Having Gideon in his proximity was a part of it, she thought. Having an older man who treated him seriously and taught him things and expected good work from him without making the expectation a burden. Her father's health improved slowly through the fall. The warmth had helped, and the better food that Aunt Mary had insisted on before she went back to Kansas in November, and the peace, Francis thought. The peace of the resolved thing. He was not well in the way he had been before the fever, probably would never be exactly that way again, but he was substantially better, and on the best days he walked in the kitchen garden and pottered about the yard with his cane and ate 2 good meals a day, and argued happily with Thomas about whatever topic presented itself. He moved into the Fletcher farmhouse with Thomas, which was right and logical, and Frances moved into the Conroy house, which she had begun in the small ways that make a house a home. The curtains already hanging, and she added her mother's quilt to the bed and her books to the shelf alongside Gideon's, and her kitchen things to the kitchen, and within a week it felt like hers as naturally as if it had always been. The mornings were her favorite thing about her new life, which surprised her because she had thought it would be the evenings, the companionship of evenings. But the mornings were when the day was new and full of potential and Gideon was there, sitting across the breakfast table, reading the farm almanac, or just looking out the window at the early light on his land. And there was a comfort in that presence that went beyond anything she could have anticipated from a list of qualities she wanted in a partner. It was simply him and her in the morning, and it was the most natural thing in the world. They had neighbors over for supper in December, the Harmons from the East Road, who were a sensible couple with 3 young children and a good sense of humor, and the evening was warm and loud with the children's noise and the adults' laughter. And afterward, washing the dishes together while the lamp burned low, Gideon said, "I like that." "The company?" she asked. "All of it," he said. "The house full of people, the children." She looked at him over the dish towel. He was looking at the kitchen with a calm, assessing expression. "We have time," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't rushing the thought, just having it." She put the last dish away and folded the cloth and turned to him. "I have been having the thought too," she said. He smiled at her then, the full smile, the one that wasn't the held-back version, the one she sometimes still thought of as a rare and particular gift when it appeared. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was not as brutal as the previous one, for which everyone in the territory was grateful. There was snow and cold, but manageable, and the cattle came through well enough. Frances spent the winter months on plans, the detailed, specific kind that she had always been drawn to. The expansion of the kitchen garden for spring, the addition of 2 milk cows she had her eye on from a farm east of town, the roses that needed their first real pruning after the winter. She also spent a great deal of it with Gideon in the evenings, by the stove, reading and talking, playing chess. She had learned from her father's enthusiasm for it, and Gideon was a worthy opponent, and sometimes just being in the same room in the comfortable way of people who have settled into each other's presence without losing their interest in each other, which she thought was the real trick of it, the real thing to maintain. They talked about Gideon's new breeding program in detail, the 2 young bulls he was working with, his assessments of their potential. He had found in a rancher down near Enid a bull of promising bloodlines whose owner was willing to discuss a partnership arrangement, and this occupied him through the winter with a constructive optimism that she was glad to see because she knew the loss of Duke had cost him more than he let on. "Do you regret it?" she asked him one evening. He knew immediately what she was asking. He thought about it properly, which was what he always did with questions that deserved proper consideration. "No," he said. "I would do it the same way again." "You sacrificed 3 years of work," she said. "I gained you," he said simply. "The arithmetic is clear." She put her book down and looked at him across the small distance between their chairs by the stove. "You know," she said, When I first found out what you had done, what you had given up, I felt two things at once. I felt overwhelmed by the generosity of it, and I felt a fear that I would never be able to give you back something of equivalent worth. Francis, he said. Let me finish, she said. I have been working out how to say this for months. I am saying it now. I have realized that I was thinking about it wrong. You didn't trade Duke for a transaction that needed to be balanced. You did it because the kind of man you are would not let a good family lose their home when he had the means to prevent it. And the thing I can give you in return is not something equal in money. It's just myself, completely, for my whole life. The fire made a settling sound in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. He crossed the small distance between them and knelt down beside her chair so that they were at eye level, and he held her face in his hands and looked at her with the full force of his attention. That is exactly and completely enough, he said. That is more than enough. That is everything I wanted. She put her forehead to his, and they were quiet together in the fire-lit room. Spring of 1883 came and brought with it a particular richness that seemed, to Francis, to partake of the general feeling that the world was arranged correctly. The kitchen garden doubled in size as planned. The 2 milk cows arrived, solid brown animals with excellent dispositions and extraordinary output, and Francis learned the specific rhythms of dairy work, which were different from cattle work, and threw herself into it with her characteristic thoroughness. She began selling butter to the hotel in Dunn's Crossing, which generated a modest but meaningful income. The roses put out their first real blooms in June. She stood at the front fence one morning in the middle of June and looked at them, the deep pink of the one variety and the white of the other against the cedar posts. And she thought about her mother, about Eleanor Fletcher, who had crossed an ocean as a child and a continent as a young woman, and had broken ground in unfamiliar territory and made a home, and planted nothing so beautiful as what she had always meant to plant, because there was always something more pressing. She said quietly to the roses and to the morning and to wherever her mother was, I planted them, Mama. I finally planted them. Gideon came up behind her and stood at her shoulder and looked at the roses. They look right, he said. Yes, she said. They do. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood at the fence in the June morning in front of the roses that were finally growing, and something in Francis that had been held tightly since her mother's death, since the foreclosure notice, since all of the years of managing and holding and being the responsible one, that thing let go. She was not going to cry over roses. She absolutely was not. But her eyes went bright and she pressed her face briefly into his shoulder and breathed him in, and he held her without saying anything unnecessary, because he was the kind of person who understood when nothing needed to be said. The news came in late June, when she had been beginning to suspect but had not yet allowed herself to be certain. She told Gideon on a Sunday evening after supper, simply and directly, in the way she did everything. His expression went through several things in quick succession that she watched with a deep and abiding affection, surprise, a rapid recalibration, something that was visibly joy coming up through him like water rising in a well. Are you certain? He asked. Not entirely, she said, but largely. He stood up from the table and came around it and gathered her to him in a way that was different from his usual embrace, more careful and more complete at once. Are you all right? He asked. I am wonderful, she said, and meant it entirely. She told her father the following day. Samuel Fletcher received the news with a quality of happiness that she had not seen in him since before the sickness, a brightness in his eyes and a fullness in his face that was good to see. Your mother would be so pleased, he said. I know, she said. As am I, he said. As am I, Francis. Thomas, when told, went entirely red in the face and then laughed and then was embarrassed by the laughing and recovered his composure enough to shake Gideon's hand very vigorously. You'll need more room, Thomas said practically. That back room he's building is being finished immediately, Gideon confirmed, with the satisfaction of a man whose preparation has proved well-timed. The summer advanced. Frances worked carefully, moderating the heaviest labor and letting Gideon and Thomas take on more of the physical demands, which required some negotiation, because she was not a woman who found it easy to step back from work she was accustomed to doing. Gideon did not manage this with commands or overprotective anxiety. He managed it by simply being present and by taking up the work before she reached it, and by occasionally saying with great mildness, "I can do that," until she found herself allowing it more naturally. Her father, in a good stretch of health through August, decided to teach Thomas to play the fiddle, which he had learned as a young man and not touched in years. The sounds that came from the Fletcher farmhouse during this period were educational in the particular way of early fiddle practice, and she and Gideon went to supper with them twice a week and sat through the lessons with patient expressions. "He will be good eventually," Gideon said, riding home one evening. "My father, Thomas," he said, "he has the ear for it. He just needs the fingers to catch up with the ear." She looked at her husband in the evening light, at his profile against the fading sky, and thought about how he noticed things about the people she loved and kept the observations carefully and warmly. "You are a very good man," she told him. He looked at her sideways. "I am trying to be," he said. "I consider it an ongoing project." The baby came in February of 1884, in the deep of winter, with the wind driving snow against the windows, and the stove worked hard and the lamp burning steadily through the long hours. Dr. Caldwell came out from Dunn's Crossing in the cold, a steady and capable man who had delivered most of the children in the county, and Gideon paced outside the bedroom door with an entirely abandoned composure that she would have found amusing if she had been in any condition to find things amusing. She heard him through the door, his footstep back and forth, and it steadied her in some way that she hadn't expected his proximity to steady her. She was not alone in this. Whatever this was, he was outside that door in the cold pacing, which was not a thing a man did for a transaction, which was not a thing a man did for something he could walk away from. It was what a man did when the person on the other side of that door was the center of everything. The baby was a boy. He was large and red-faced and bellowing with an energy that Dr. Caldwell said was an excellent sign, and he had a shock of dark hair that appeared to come from both sides of his heritage simultaneously. And when they put him in Gideon's arms for the first time, Gideon stood very still and looked at him with an expression that Frances, watching from the pillow, would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Hello," Gideon said to the baby, in the quietest voice she had ever heard from him. "I have been looking forward to meeting you." The baby stared up at him with the unfocused attention of the very newly arrived. They named him Samuel Elias Conroy, Samuel for her father, Elias for Gideon's father. Gideon had proposed this with a slight tentativeness, as though he was uncertain she would want to use his father's name as well as hers, and she had said yes immediately, because it seemed right that the baby should carry both histories, and because Gideon's quiet offering of his family name alongside hers was the kind of thing that widened her heart. Samuel Fletcher received the news from Thomas, who rode over through the snow, and the older man's reaction was reported by Thomas with his characteristic straightforward energy. He got up out of his chair and he said, "Samuel," and then he sat back down and he was very quiet for a while, and then he said, "Bring me my good hat, I'm going to see that child." He came the next day in the wagon with Thomas, wrapped in his heavy coat, and he held his grandson and was silent in the way of people in the presence of something that exceeds their capacity for ordinary expression. The spring of 1884 was the beginning of what Frances would later think of as the full life, the life that had all of its component parts assembled and functioning. There was still hard work, and there was still difficulty. A wet summer that complicated the harvest, a bad bout of the croup with the baby that frightened them both considerably, until Dr. Caldwell came and it resolved. But there was also the fundamental rightness of it, the sense that the structure was sound. Gideon's new breeding program was producing results. The partnership arrangement with the rancher south of Enid had developed well, and he had 2 young bulls coming along that he spoke about with increasing confidence. The Fletcher farm, now managed jointly by Thomas and under Francis's regular supervision, was producing steadily, and the dairy operation had grown to 4 cows and was supplying not only the hotel but 2 or 3 families in town on a regular basis. Thomas, at 18, was growing into a man with a genuine gift for cattle work, and a patience with animals that made Gideon trust him with tasks he would not trust every grown hand. The fiddle had improved beyond recognition. He had also, Francis noticed, begun attending church functions with considerably more enthusiasm than their practical distance from town had previously demanded, and she had observed him in conversation with a young woman named Clara Jeffries, the teacher's daughter, with an intensity that was both obvious and sweet. She mentioned it to Gideon. "I noticed," he said. "She seems like a good girl," Francis said. "She seems like a sensible, intelligent young woman," Gideon said, "which is what he needs." And he looked at her the way a person looks at someone who has just made them understand something new about the world, which is usually a good sign. Francis considered this. "Did you look at me that way?" He looked at her across the supper table with the quiet directness that was so essentially himself. "I still do," he said. Baby Samuel in his cradle in the corner made the satisfied sound of a well-fed and comfortable person. The summer of 1884 was warm and productive. Francis's kitchen garden at the Conroy house was becoming genuinely remarkable. She had a talent for it that had grown with dedicated attention, and the variety she was growing now included things she had ordered from catalogs. A small asparagus bed that would take 3 years to fully produce, but which she was entirely content to wait for. Herbs both culinary and medicinal, and the steady rows of vegetables that fed them through the season and into the winter cellared. She and Gideon rode the south boundary of the combined property on a morning in August, checking the fence line together, Samuel strapped against her in the practical cloth carrier she had devised from instructions in a magazine, asleep against her chest in the reliable way of babies who have found comfortable motion. The south pasture fence was holding, and the grass was good, and the cattle were where they should be. They stopped at the highest point of the land, which was not very high but high enough to see the full breadth of it, both their holdings, the fields and the buildings and the creek lined silver in the morning distance. "It's a good piece of country," Gideon said. "It is," Francis agreed. She looked at all of it, the land her father had broken and the land Gideon had built, and the way they had grown together at the fence line where they met, no longer entirely separate things but a continuous piece of something. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it without the self-consciousness that some people would have brought to the question. He asked it directly, the way he asked everything. She looked at him in the August morning with the baby sleeping between them and the land spreading out below. She thought about all of the way she had traveled to reach this specific place, this morning, this man. "Yes," she said, and felt the complete truth of it. Genuinely and fully yes. He reached out and put his hand briefly over the baby's head, and then against her cheek, warm and steady. "Good," he said. "So am I." Her father lived to see Samuel take his first steps, which happened on a Tuesday in April of 1885 in the front room of the Fletcher farmhouse, where Samuel had been deposited for his grandfather's regular holding, while Francis did her Tuesday marketing in town. He wrote her a letter about it, which Thomas delivered, and the letter was written in her father's handwriting, which had grown more careful over the winter as his hands showed the effects of the weather and the years, but was still perfectly legible and entirely him. "He crossed the whole of the room," the letter said, "fell twice and got up both times and looked exceedingly pleased with himself. He has your determination. This is either very good or a considerable warning to everyone around him. I am proud of you, Francis. Of all of it. Your mother would say the same." She read the letter at the kitchen table and let herself cry properly into her apron, and then washed her face and went back to the work of the afternoon. Her father passed quietly in the following November, in his own bed, with Thomas beside him in his sleep. The doctor said it was his heart, which had been carrying a long accumulating weight, and that it was gentle and as good a way as any and better than most. Thomas came for them at first light, and Francis and Gideon drove over through the gray November morning and sat with Samuel Fletcher for a while before the practical things needed to be attended to. She held her grief for her father with both hands, fully, without trying to manage it into something smaller, and Gideon was there through all of it with the steadiness she had come to know as bone deep in him, not diminishing what she felt but standing in it with her. They buried him beside Eleanor Fletcher in the small churchyard at Dunn's Crossing, and Reverend Holt spoke well of a man who had come to the territory with nothing but intention and had made something lasting, and Francis thought that was exactly right. Thomas moved into the Conroy house with them for the winter, because the farmhouse alone was too quiet and they had the room. He was not a burden. He was help and company and the continuity of something essential, and he and Gideon worked well together through the cold months. Clara Jeffries came to Sunday supper twice in that period, accompanied by her parents, which was appropriate and suggested something developing at its proper pace. In the spring, Thomas moved back to the Fletcher farm, which was his farm now, legally and completely, because their father had seen to the matter of its title before his death, and because Francis did not want it or need it beyond the wanting that was sentiment. Thomas needed it and would work it well and would, she thought, eventually fill it up with Clara and whatever came after Clara, and the land would go on being what it was supposed to be. They planted the spring crop together, all three of them plus Clara Jeffries, who turned out to have excellent opinions about soil preparation and no shyness about expressing them. And the season got off to the kind of start that made you feel cautiously optimistic in the way that farming always demanded, never fully certain, never able to declare victory over the weather or the insects or the thousand other variables, but on a good day, genuinely hopeful. Francis planted more roses. She had read about grafting in a horticultural pamphlet and had attempted it with partial success, and she had ordered 3 new varieties from a nursery in Kansas City, which seemed the height of ambition and extravagance for a cattle ranch in Oklahoma Territory, and which she felt completely justified in. She planted them along the south side of the house, where they got the full afternoon sun, and she had plans for an eventual pergola that Gideon had agreed to build when the other building priorities cleared. Samuel, now a year and some months, was in the stage of interested and destructive investigation of the world, and the garden required a degree of supervision that she had not previously needed, because he had opinions about the seedlings that did not align with her own. She put him in the sun with a collection of safe objects and talked to him while she worked, the way her mother had talked to her in the garden, and he listened with the grave focus of a small person processing everything. "Tomatoes go here," she would say, firming the soil around a transplant, and he would look at the tomato plant with the absolute seriousness of an interested party. Gideon came by one morning when she was having this conversation with her son, and stood at the garden fence watching them with an expression that she did not see, being engaged with the tomatoes, but that Thomas saw when he came around the side of the house, and quietly noted as the expression of a man who is looking at the exact thing he wants to be looking at for the rest of his life. The years that followed had the shape of years that are doing what they should, marked by seasons and work, and the specific increments of children growing and plans becoming reality, and small unexpected things interrupting and being incorporated. They were not years without difficulty, because no years are, but they were years in which the foundation was solid enough that the difficulties could be managed as what they were rather than as threats to the whole. The breeding program produced its long-awaited result in the fall of 1886, when Gideon took one of his young bulls, a massive red animal with an impressive pedigree, to the regional show in Caldwell, and came home with the first-place ribbon that he hung, with a brevity of ceremony that was entirely him, on the barn wall beside the workbench where the harness mending happened. Francis baked a cake. It was a good cake, the kind that required real effort, and they sat down to it that evening, she and Gideon and Samuel, who was nearly 3 and had strong feelings about cake. And it was a celebration that she felt matched the thing being celebrated, quiet and real and deeply satisfying. Duke would be pleased, she said. He looked at her across the table, surprised by the mention of the bull, and then something in his face gentled. I think he would, he said. You built it back, she said. Exactly what you said you would. It took longer, he said. Good things often do, she said. He poured the coffee and slid a piece of cake to Samuel with the practiced precision of a father who has learned the exact angle at which cake must be presented to avoid disaster. There is something I want to tell you, Francis said. He looked at her. We are going to need the room after all, she said. The back room. He was still for a moment, and then the full smile appeared, the real one. How certain are you? He asked. Quite certain this time, she said. Samuel, unaware of the significance of the moment, put his finger in the frosting of his cake and looked extremely satisfied with the result. The second baby came in the spring of 1887, a girl this time, with Francis's auburn hair already showing in the little head and Gideon's dark eyes, and they named her Eleanor Mary Eleanor for Francis's mother, Mary for her aunt who had wept at the wedding, and who wept again when the letter arrived with the news, in her distant Kansas kitchen, with the particular joy of aunts who are included in the name of things. Gideon held Eleanor the way he had held Samuel, with that same quality of stillness and complete attention, and he said very quietly to the small face, Hello, there are roses in the garden. I will show you when you're ready. Francis watched him with her whole heart, with everything she was, and thought that this, exactly this, was what she had been given in exchange for the hardest year of her life, which was the best trade she could ever have imagined. Thomas and Clara were married the following June, in the same church, with the same reverend, and Francis stood at the front with the particular fullness of someone watching a beloved person arrive at their right place. Clara was practical and warm, and had the good sense to find Thomas's earnestness endearing rather than overwhelming, and she moved into the Fletcher farmhouse with a confidence that said she understood it was hers now to make what she would of it. They were all, that summer, gathered around the supper table at the Conroy house for a Sunday dinner, the way they were most Sundays, Gideon and Francis, Samuel and baby Eleanor, Thomas and Clara, who was expecting by then, Aunt Mary visiting from Kansas because she visited every summer now, which had become its own kind of tradition. And the table was full and the room was warm and the food was good. And outside the windows the Oklahoma summer was doing its tremendous, golden, demanding thing. And the roses Francis had planted along the south side of the house were in their fullest bloom. After supper, when the dishes were done and Aunt Mary had settled with Thomas and Clara on the porch and the babies were sleeping, Francis and Gideon walked out to the south side of the house in the long summer evening and stood in front of the roses. They were beautiful. She had known they would be, eventually. It had taken 3 years of tending, of feeding and pruning and protecting through winters, and now they were reaching the peak of what they were capable of, deep pink and white, and one new variety that was an extraordinary yellow gold, covering the south wall with something that had no practical purpose and every reason to exist. Gideon put his arm around her in the evening light. You planted the roses, he said, referencing something she had told him a long time ago, on one of their first evenings at the creek. I planted the roses, she said. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and they were both older than they had been in the dust of that April morning when a foreclosure notice changed the shape of a life, older and more certain and more thoroughly themselves. I love you, he said, and it was the same as the first time he had said it, direct and clear and entirely meant, and it was also different because now it contained the weight of everything they had been together, every morning and every difficulty and every good thing and every child and every season. I love you, she said back. Same words, same meaning, more of everything behind them. The Oklahoma evening settled around them, golden and vast, and the roses stood in their blooming, And inside the house their family made the sounds of a family, voices and laughter and the particular creaking of a home in use. And everything that had once been broken or threatened or carried alone was now whole and shared and lit from within. She had lost her mother and her father, and the fear of losing the land. She had gained this man and these children and this life that was more than the sum of its parts. She had gained the mornings across the breakfast table and the evenings, by the stove, and the long conversations that made her more herself rather than less. She had gained a partner in the full and serious sense of the word, a person who stood with her rather than in front of her or behind her, who valued what she was and not what she might become with managing. And he had given up his prize bull and gotten back everything that mattered and more beside, and he knew it. They stood by the roses until the light went and the stars came out, the full Oklahoma sky, and they went inside together to the warmth and the company of the life they had built. And the door closed behind them, and there was the sound of laughter from within, and the yellow light in the windows against the dark, and the roses stood in the starlight, finally planted, fully blooming, exactly where they were meant to be.